The throne room of the Celestian Empire shimmered with light from 1,000 stars, and Queen Lyrian stood at its center with her hand resting on the massive head of Vexrith, her bonded dragon, who coiled beside her like a living mountain of scales and cosmic energy. The delegation from the Krillian Dominion approached with careful steps, and their leader bowed low before speaking words of alliance and trade. But Lyrian felt something wrong in the air, like a storm about to break, and Vexrith rumbled deep in his chest, sensing the same danger. High Advisor Morvain stood beside her throne, as he always did, and his face showed nothing but calm respect. Yet when Lyrian glanced at him, she caught something in his eyes that made her blood run cold, and in that moment she knew the truth, but it was already too late. The Krillian leader raised his hand, and the walls of the throne room erupted with blinding energy as weapons hidden in the very structure of the palace activated and tore through dimensional barriers with a sound like reality itself screaming, and Lyrian felt her psionic powers drain away as if someone had cut the connection between her mind and the universe. Vexrith roared and lunged forward, but the weapon affected him too, and his cosmic flames sputtered and died as he crashed to the floor with blood flowing from wounds that should never have been able to touch a dragon of his power, and all around them the royal guards fell, as Morvain's true allies revealed themselves. Morvain stepped forward with a smile that held no warmth, and declared that the old empire had grown weak under Lyrian's peaceful rule, and that the galaxy needed strength, not compassion, and he would provide that strength as the new regent. Once she was gone, Lyrian grabbed Vexrith and poured what little power remained into a desperate spell, and space itself tore open before them as a wormhole materialized, and she threw herself onto her dragon's back as he lurched into the air on damaged wings, and they plunged into the swirling portal just as energy blasts turned the air where they had stood into superheated plasma. The wormhole tunnel twisted around them, and the weapon's residual energy destabilized everything, and Lyrian held on to Vexrith as reality broke apart in fragments of color and impossible geometry, and she felt her body burning as dimensional forces tore at her flesh and consciousness. They fell through the collapsing portal and into normal space above an unknown planet, and Vexrith tried to control their descent, but his wings were shredded, and his power nearly gone, and they plummeted through clouds and atmosphere with fire trailing behind them like a dying star. The impact shook the forest for miles around, and trees shattered under the force of their crash, and Lyrian was thrown clear of Vexrith's body and rolled across the ground until she came to rest against a boulder with every bone in her body screaming in agony. She lay there for long moments unable to move, and her silver hair was matted with blood that glowed faintly blue in the darkness, and her luminescent skin flickered like a dying light, and around her the wreckage of their landing smoldered and burned. Vexrith crawled toward her, and he was small now, barely the size of an earth horse when he should have been vast as a mountain, and his scales were cracked and bleeding cosmic energy that dissipated into the air like steam. And he pressed his great head against her shoulder and sent a weak telepathic pulse, asking if she lived. Lyrian forced herself to sit up and looked around at the primitive forest surrounding them, and she reached out with her senses and felt nothing familiar and no connection to the Empire and no way to call for help. And they were alone on a world that registered as restricted in her fading memory banks. The sound of footsteps made Vexrith raise his head with a weak growl, and a figure emerged from the trees carrying some kind of primitive projectile weapon and wearing strange clothing made of plant fibers and synthetic materials. Maya Rodriguez stopped dead when she saw them, and her mind struggled to process what her eyes were showing her, because there was a woman with silver hair and glowing skin and pointed ears, like something from a fantasy story, and beside her was a creature that could only be described as a dragon. The woman looked at Maya with eyes that shifted color like nebulae and tried to speak, but the words came out in a language Maya had never heard, and the sound of it was like music and mathematics combined and completely incomprehensible. Maya lowered her rifle slowly and held up her hands to show she meant no harm, and she took a careful step forward, and the dragon watched her with intelligence that was definitely not animal, and she could feel the weight of its gaze measuring her soul. Lyraean reached for the device at her belt and pulled out something that looked like crystal and metal fused together, and she pressed it against her temple and spoke again, and this time the words came out broken but understandable as the neural translator struggled to process this primitive language. "Help us," and Lyraean said. And her voice was weak with pain and desperation, and Maya saw in those alien eyes the same look she had seen in wounded soldiers during her time in the Marines. And it was a look that transcended species and spoke of someone who had lost everything but refused to give up. Maya made a decision that would change her life and the fate of worlds beyond counting, and she stepped forward and reached out her hand to the alien queen and said she would help them, and Vexrith's eyes gleamed with something that might have been approval or gratitude. The dragon allowed Maya to approach, and she got her first close look at the wounds covering both of them, and her medical training told her these injuries should be fatal, but somehow they were still alive and fighting, and she knew she had to get them somewhere safe before whoever had done this came looking for them. Maya helped Lyraean to her feet, and the alien queen was surprisingly light, despite being nearly 6 feet tall, and her skin was warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with faint light, and Vexrith struggled to stand on legs that trembled with exhaustion and pain. Together they made their way through the forest, and Maya guided them toward her cabin, which was miles away through rough terrain. But she knew every path and every hiding spot from years of living alone in the Montana wilderness. Lyraean stumbled several times, and each time Maya caught her, and the alien queen looked at her with wonder, because in all her long life no one had shown her such simple kindness, without expecting anything in return. Vexrith followed behind them, and his claws left deep marks in the earth, and occasionally he would stop and turn his head to listen, and Maya knew he was watching for pursuers, and she felt safer knowing this wounded dragon was still capable of defending them if needed. As they walked through the darkness with only the stars above to light their way, Maya wondered what she had gotten herself into and whether she would regret this choice. But when she looked at Lyraean's face and saw the determination there despite the pain, she knew she had made the right decision. The cabin appeared ahead through the trees, and it was small and simple, but it was home, and it was safe, and Maya led them inside and helped Lyraean onto the bed, while Vexrith curled up near the fireplace and his breathing was labored but steady. Maya grabbed her first aid kit and started treating their wounds with supplies meant for humans, but Lyraean's biology was close enough that the basics worked, and the alien queen watched her work with eyes that held 1,000 questions, but she was too weak to ask them. Outside, the night deepened, and somewhere far above in orbit, sensors had detected the crash and recorded the energy signature, and already messages were being sent across the stars to those who would pay any price to see Queen Lyraean dead, and the hunt was beginning. The morning light filtered through the cabin windows, and Maya woke to find Lyraean sitting upright on the bed with her neural translator device pressed against her temple, and her eyes closed in concentration, and the device was learning English at a remarkable speed by scanning Maya's sleeping thoughts. Vexrith lay by the fireplace, and he was larger than he had been the night before, as if rest had allowed him to recover some of his strength, and his scales gleamed with a faint inner light, and when he opened his eyes to look at Maya, she felt a presence touch her mind like a gentle whisper. The dragon spoke directly into her thoughts, and his voice was ancient and warm, and he thanked her for her kindness to his queen, and Maya nearly dropped the coffee pot she was holding because telepathy was supposed to be impossible, and yet here it was happening to her. Lyraean opened her eyes and spoke in much clearer English now, and she explained that Vexrith had always been able to sense minds, but forming words with humans should have been impossible because their species lacked the proper neural structures, and yet Maya seemed different somehow. Maya sat down heavily in a chair and asked what was happening and who they were and why someone was trying to kill them, and Lyrian took a deep breath and began to explain about the Celestian Empire and the betrayal and the weapon that had stripped away their power. The alien queen spoke of worlds beyond counting and civilizations that had existed for thousands of years, and of her role as the keeper of peace across vast reaches of space. And Maya listened with growing wonder and disbelief, because this was beyond anything she had imagined when she found them. Lyrian explained that Earth was listed as a restricted world in the galactic database because the species here had not yet developed faster than light travel, and making contact with such civilizations was forbidden until they reached a certain level of advancement. Maya felt a flash of anger at being called primitive. But then she looked at Lyrian's technology and the dragon who could speak with thoughts, and she had to admit that humanity still had a long way to go. Vexrith rumbled and sent an image into Maya's mind of the Celestians before they had become an advanced civilization, and they had looked much like humans, and had fought and struggled and built everything they had through determination and will, and he said that humans reminded him of that ancient time. Over the next few days, Maya helped them recover, and she learned more about the galaxy beyond Earth, and Lyrian was amazed by how much humans had accomplished without any of the advantages of psionic powers or advanced technology. Maya showed Lyrian books about human history, and the alien queen read about wars and revolutions and ordinary people who had stood against impossible odds and won through courage alone, and something in those stories stirred something in her heart. Lyrian had been raised to believe that civilization meant the absence of conflict, and that advanced beings should be above such primitive emotions as anger or fierce determination. But watching Maya move through her daily life with quiet strength made her question those beliefs. Vexrith began teaching Maya basic psionic exercises, and he was careful to start slowly because human minds were not designed for this, and pushing too hard could cause permanent damage. But Maya learned quickly, and within days she could sense his presence without him actively contacting her. The dragon was fascinated by how human brains worked, and they were inefficient and clumsy compared to Celestian neural structures, but they had a flexibility and adaptability that allowed them to learn things that should take decades in mere days. Maya discovered she could feel emotions from both Lyrian and Vexrith when she concentrated, and the alien queen's sadness was like an ocean, and beneath it was a core of determination that burned like a star, and the dragon's mind was vast and ancient, and filled with memories of things Maya could barely comprehend. They fell into a routine, and Maya would go into town for supplies and return to find Lyrian practicing her restored abilities in the clearing behind the cabin, and the alien queen could make objects float now and create shields of energy and even manipulate the local wildlife with gentle telepathic suggestions. Vexrith grew stronger each day, and he was now the size of a large truck, and his cosmic flames had returned enough that he could breathe fire that burned with colors that did not exist in normal physics, and Maya watched in awe as he demonstrated his power. But the piece could not last, and electronic devices in the area began malfunctioning with increasing frequency, and Maya's satellite phone stopped working, and her truck's engine would not start, and strange lights appeared in the sky at night. Lyrian sensed it first, and she told Maya that someone was tracking them, using the residual energy from their crash, and that hunters would be coming soon, and they needed to prepare for a fight. Maya asked why they did not just run and hide somewhere else, but Lyrian explained that the energy signature followed them wherever they went, and running would only delay the inevitable, and besides, she was tired of running and ready to face her enemies. The alien queen had changed during her time on Earth, and the fear that had driven her to flee was being replaced by something harder and more determined, and Maya recognized it as the same quality that had kept humanity alive through countless disasters. Vexrith approved of this change, and he told Maya telepathically that his queen had been too gentle for too long, and that sometimes the only answer to violence was to meet it with greater force, and that humans understood this in a way the Celestians had forgotten. Maya went into town one last time and bought all the ammunition she could find and extra weapons and supplies. And the store owner gave her strange looks, but did not ask questions because everyone in this area minded their own business. When she returned to the cabin, she found Lyrian and Vexrith waiting in the clearing, and the alien queen wore an expression of grim determination, and she told Maya that the hunters had entered Earth's atmosphere and would arrive within hours. Maya checked her rifles and handguns, and made sure everything was loaded and ready, and she had faced enemy combatants before during her time in the Marines, but never anything like this, and never with stakes this high. Lyrian placed her hand on Maya's shoulder and thanked her for everything, and said that she did not have to fight and that she could leave now and be safe. But Maya shook her head and said she was not going anywhere. The bond between them had grown strong over the past weeks, and it was no longer just about helping a stranger in need, and Maya had come to care deeply for this alien queen who had shown her that there was so much more to the universe than she had ever dreamed. Vexrith sent waves of approval and affection toward both of them, and he had bonded with Maya almost as deeply as with Lyrian, and he would protect them both with everything he had and die before letting harm come to either of them. As the sun set, they took their positions, and Maya found high ground with clear sightlines, and Lyrian stood in the clearing with her hands glowing with psionic energy, and Vexrith perched on a boulder with his scales reflecting the last light of day. The forest grew silent as all the animals fled from the approaching danger, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath, and Maya's hands were steady on her rifle because fear was useless now, and all that mattered was being ready. 3 ships descended through the clouds, and they were small and sleek and bristling with weapons, and they landed in a triangle around the cabin, and armored figures emerged carrying guns that hummed with deadly energy. The lead hunter called out in a language Maya did not understand, and Lyrian responded in the same tongue, and her voice was cold and commanding, and Maya heard the word for surrender in the alien speech. Lyrian's answer was to raise her hands and send a pulse of psionic energy that slammed into the nearest hunter and threw him backward into his ship. And the battle began with fire and fury that would change both their lives forever. The hunters opened fire with weapons that turned trees to ash and carved trenches in the earth, and Maya dove behind cover as energy bolts screamed past her head and superheated the air until it burned her lungs. She returned fire with her rifle, and the bullets bounced off their personal shields, but she kept shooting because she needed to draw their attention away from Lyrian, who was gathering her power for something big. Vexrith launched himself into the air with a roar that shook the ground, and he breathed cosmic fire that bypassed the hunters' shields and melted their armor like wax, and 2 of them went down screaming before the others could adjust their defenses. Lyrian moved like lightning, and her hands wove patterns in the air as she manipulated gravity and mass, and one hunter found himself crushed under his own suddenly multiplied weight, while another floated helplessly into the air before being thrown against a tree hard enough to shatter bone. But there were too many of them, and they had come prepared, and one pulled out a device that emitted a field designed to disrupt psionic abilities, and Lyrian gasped as her power flickered and failed. Maya saw the alien queen stumble and acted without thinking, and she ran from cover straight toward the hunter with the device, and her bullets finally found a weakness in his shield at close range, and he went down. The other hunters turned toward Maya, and she knew she was about to die, but then Vexrith was there, and his massive body shielded her from their fire, and his tail swept 3 of them off their feet, and his jaws closed on another with a sickening crunch. Lyrian's power returned, and she was furious now, and all pretense of civilized restraint was gone. And she reached into the minds of the remaining hunters and showed them their worst fears made real, and they broke and ran screaming toward their ships. But the lead hunter was made of sterner stuff, and he activated a larger version of the psionic dampener, and this one affected even Vexrith, and the dragon fell from the sky with a pained roar and crashed into the cabin, which exploded in splinters and flame. Maya emptied her magazine into the lead hunter, but his shield held, and he turned toward her with a weapon that glowed with lethal intent, and she knew she had no chance. But she stood her ground because running meant leaving Lyraean, and that was not an option. The hunter fired, and Maya braced for death. But Lyraean threw herself between them, and the energy bolt meant for Maya struck the alien queen in the chest and burned through her body, and she fell. Something broke inside Maya when she saw Lyraean go down, and a rage like nothing she had ever felt before consumed her mind, and she did not know how, but suddenly she could feel the psionic energy around her. The way Lyraean had taught her, Maya reached for that energy without understanding what she was doing, and she pulled it into herself and directed it at the lead hunter with all her fury and will, and his shield shattered like glass, and then his armor, and then his body. The remaining hunters, who had tried to flee, now turned back in horror because they had never seen a human use psionic power, and it should have been impossible, and they opened fire on Maya with everything they had. But Vexrith had recovered enough to act, and he placed himself over both Maya and the fallen Lyraean, and his scales turned their weapons aside, and his roar promised death to any who came closer. Maya dropped to her knees beside Lyraean, and the alien queen's breathing was shallow, and blood that glowed blue in the darkness poured from the wound in her chest, and her eyes were glazing over. Lyraean whispered that Maya should run and save herself, and that she had done more than anyone could have asked. But Maya refused, and she pressed her hands against the wound and tried to stop the bleeding. Vexrith sent desperate telepathic calls for help. In all directions, and somewhere far above, military satellites detected the energy signatures, and alarms began to sound in government facilities, and fighter jets scrambled to investigate. The remaining hunters regrouped and prepared for a final assault, and they had orders to ensure Queen Lyraean died, and one human and a wounded dragon would not stop them from completing their mission. But before they could attack, a new sound filled the air, and it was the roar of jet engines and helicopter rotors, and human military forces descended on the area with overwhelming numbers. The hunters found themselves surrounded by soldiers and tanks and attack helicopters, and they had been told this was a primitive world, but these primitives had weapons that could kill even if they lacked advanced technology. General Patricia Hayes stood in the command helicopter and watched the scene below through enhanced optics, and she saw the alien ships and the armored figures and the massive dragon and the woman kneeling beside an injured alien. The general had spent 30 years in the military and had seen things that never made it into official reports, and she knew that Earth had been monitored by extraterrestrial civilizations for decades, and now first contact had happened whether the government was ready or not. She ordered her forces to encircle the hunters, but not to fire unless fired upon, and she wanted prisoners for questioning if possible, and information about what was happening in her airspace. The hunters calculated their odds and decided discretion was the better part of valor, and they attempted to flee to their ships, but Maya had disabled 2 of them during the fight, and only one was still operational. The remaining hunters piled into the working ship and launched with such haste that they left their dead behind, and the ship disappeared into the sky and was tracked by satellites until it left Earth's atmosphere. General Hayes landed her helicopter in the clearing and stepped out with a security team, and she approached slowly with her hands visible and non-threatening because the dragon was watching her with eyes that promised violence if she made the wrong move. Maya looked up at the approaching soldiers, and her face was streaked with Lyraean's glowing blood, and her eyes held a wildness that spoke of someone who had crossed a line and could never go back. The general knelt beside them and looked at Lyraean's wound, and her medical training told her the alien was dying, and she called for her medics immediately, and they came running with equipment designed for humans, but willing to try anything Vexrith allowed them to approach because he could sense that these humans meant to help. and his telepathic voice touched the general's mind and asked if she could save his queen. General Hayes nearly fell over in shock at the dragon's voice in her head, but she recovered quickly and promised they would do everything possible and ordered her medics to stabilize Lyraean for transport to the nearest military hospital. The medics worked with desperate speed, and they had never seen anatomy like this. But the basics of trauma care were universal, and they stopped the bleeding and established an airway and started fluids through an IV. Lyraean was loaded onto a medical helicopter, and Maya refused to leave her side and climbed in without asking permission, and Vexrith launched himself into the air and followed the helicopter with a determination that made it clear he would destroy anyone who tried to stop him. The flight to the military hospital took 20 minutes, and during that time Maya held Lyraean's hand and whispered that she had to hold on, and that she had not saved her from assassins just to lose her. Now Lyraean's eyes opened briefly, and she looked at Maya with wonder, because in all her thousands of years no one had fought for her the way this human had, and she tried to speak but no words came. The hospital was in chaos when they arrived because the staff had been told to prepare for an alien patient, but nothing could really prepare them for the reality, and Lyraean was rushed into surgery with doctors who were making up procedures as they went. Maya was stopped at the doors to the operating room, and General Hayes placed a hand on her shoulder and guided her to a waiting room and said they needed to talk about what had happened. But Maya could not focus on questions, because all she could think about was Lyran lying on an operating table, and human doctors trying to save a life using knowledge of anatomy from a species they had never encountered. Vexrith landed on the hospital roof, and his weight made the entire building groan, and he refused to move, and his presence terrified some and awed others, and General Hayes decided to allow it, because fighting a dragon seemed like a poor use of resources. Hours passed, and Maya sat in the waiting room, and her hands still shook from the adrenaline and from whatever she had done when she used psionic power without training or understanding. Finally, a doctor emerged and said that Lyraean was stable, but critical, and that her alien biology had advantages that kept her alive, but she would need time to heal, and Maya felt relief wash over her like a wave. General Hayes sat down beside Maya and asked her to explain everything from the beginning, and Maya told her about finding the crash and helping them and learning about the galaxy and the attack. The general listened carefully, and when Maya finished, she said that Earth's governments had a decision to make because the galaxy now knew humans existed, and that could not be undone. Maya asked, what would happen to Lyran, and the general said that depended on many things, but that for now she was under military protection, and anyone who wanted to harm her would have to go through the United States Armed Forces first. In the recovery room, Lyraean dreamed of stars and battle, and a human woman with fierce eyes who had chosen to stand between her and death, and she knew that something had changed forever. Lyraean woke 3 days later in a hospital bed, surrounded by monitors displaying readings that human doctors were still trying to understand, and Maya sat in a chair beside her, having barely moved since the surgery, and their eyes met and no words were needed. General Hayes had spent those 3 days in constant meetings with military leadership and intelligence agencies and the president himself, and the debate raged about what to do with an alien queen who had brought intergalactic conflict to Earth's doorstep. But there was another faction growing among the military leadership, and they saw opportunity where others saw threat, and they recognized that Lyraean represented a chance for humanity to step onto the galactic stage with powerful allies. Vexrith remained on the hospital roof, and his presence had become something of a sensation as news crews tried to get footage, and the government struggled to maintain secrecy, and the dragon allowed Maya to visit him each day, and together they practiced psionic techniques. Maya's natural talent continued to amaze both Vexrith and Lyraean, and what should have taken years of training she accomplished in days, and the dragon theorized that humans had latent psionic potential that had never been activated because Earth lacked the proper stimuli. When Lyraean was strong enough to sit up, She told General Hayes everything, and she explained about Morvaine's betrayal and the 3 loyal systems that refused to acknowledge his regency and the civil war that was surely brewing across the stars. The general asked what Lyraean needed to reclaim her throne, and the alien queen said she needed an army and ships and the element of surprise, and she had none of those things, and even if she returned to Celestian space, her enemies would destroy her before she could rally support. General Hayes considered this and asked a question that would change the course of human history, and she asked if Lyraean would accept human soldiers in her service, and the alien queen looked at her in shock. The idea was insane, and humans had no experience with space combat, and their weapons were primitive compared to galactic standard, and they lacked psionic abilities and proper armor and 1,000 other things. But they had something else. Maya stood and spoke for the first time in the meeting, and she said that humans knew how to fight against impossible odds, and that they did not give up even when defeat seemed certain, and that if Lyraean needed soldiers who would follow her into hell, then she would find plenty of volunteers. Lyraean looked at Maya with an expression of wonder and gratitude, and something deeper, and she said that she could not ask humans to fight in a war that was not theirs, and to die for a queen they barely knew. But General Hayes smiled and said that the decision was not Lyraean's to make, and that if word got out that an alien queen needed help, there would be more volunteers than they could possibly use, and humans had a long history of fighting for causes they believed in. The proposal went up the chain of command, and after heated debate, the president authorized Operation Starguard, and a call went out for military volunteers who were willing to participate in a classified mission of extreme danger with the possibility of never returning home. The response was overwhelming, and soldiers and pilots and engineers and medics from every branch of service applied, and they were told only that they would be fighting alongside an alien ally against hostile extraterrestrial forces. Maya was offered command of the ground forces, and she initially refused because she was just a wilderness guide who used to be a Marine. But Lyraean insisted and said that she trusted Maya more than any general she had never met. A secret base was established in the Nevada desert, and the volunteers began arriving, and Vexrith transported himself there and began the work of teaching humans to use psionic abilities. And the results were remarkable. Lisa Parker was a fighter pilot who could already sense spatial relationships better than her instruments. And under Vexrith's training, she learned to feel other aircraft without seeing them and to predict enemy movements before they happened. Kate Morrison was a demolitions expert with an intuitive understanding of energy and force, and she learned to shape small psionic blasts that could disable electronic systems and enhance the effectiveness of conventional explosives. Amy Chen was a linguist who discovered she could sense emotional intent behind words, and Vexrith taught her to communicate telepathically with other humans, and even with him, which should have been impossible for someone so new to psionic training. Beth Crawford was a combat medic who found she could sense injuries without diagnostic equipment and guide her hands with psionic precision, and under Lyran's instruction, she learned techniques that combined human medicine with Celestian energy healing. The training was brutal, and some volunteers washed out because the mental strain was too great, but those who remained formed a core of fighters unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. They could not match Celestian power, but they developed their own style, and it was aggressive and creative and utterly unpredictable. And they combined conventional weapons with psionic enhancements in ways that made Lyraean shake her head in amazement. Meanwhile, engineers worked with salvaged technology from the destroyed hunter ships, and they built crude but functional vessels capable of faster-than-light travel. And the ships were ugly and inefficient, but they worked. Lyraean helped design defenses and weapon systems, and she was impressed by how quickly humans adapted alien concepts to their own technology, and by their willingness to try things that more advanced civilizations would consider too dangerous. The volunteers trained together for months, and bonds formed between them that transcended nationality and background, and they became something more than a military unit, and they became a family united by a common cause. Maya trained alongside them, and she pushed herself harder than anyone, and Lyraean watched with concern, because Maya seemed driven by something beyond duty, and it was as if she was trying to prove something to herself. One night Lyraean found Maya alone in the training facility, and the human was exhausted and covered in sweat, but still practicing combat techniques, and Lyraean sat beside her and asked why she drove herself so hard. Maya was silent for a long moment, and then she admitted that when she saw Lyraean fall during the battle, something had broken inside her, and she realized she cared about the alien queen more than she had cared about anyone in years. Lyran felt her heart skip, and Celestians had two hearts, and she reached out and took Maya's hand and said that she felt the same, and that Maya had shown her what it meant to have someone fight for you, not out of duty but out of choice. They sat together in the darkness and talked about the coming war and the likelihood that many would not return, and Maya said she was afraid, but not of dying, and she was afraid of failing Lyraean and failing the soldiers who trusted her. Lyraean told her that fear was not weakness, and that the bravest warriors were those who felt fear and acted anyway, and that Maya was the strongest person she had ever known, regardless of species. The moment was interrupted by alarms, and General Hayes burst into the facility and said that long-range sensors had detected ships entering the solar system, and they were Celestian in design and broadcasting Morvaine's signature. The enemy had found them, and the time for training was over, and it was time to see if humans could really stand against galactic powers and win. Lyraean stood, and her eyes blazed with determination, and she said they would not wait to be attacked, and they would take the fight to Morvaine and reclaim her throne and show the galaxy that the Celestian Empire would not fall to treachery. Maya gathered the volunteers and told them that the enemy was coming, and that they had a choice to make, and they could stay and defend Earth, or they could go on the offensive and strike at the heart of the enemy. Every single volunteer chose to fight, and they boarded the ships with weapons ready and psionics charged, and determination burning in their hearts. Vexrith flew alongside the fleet, and he had grown enormous during his time on Earth, and feeding on human determination had made him stronger than ever before. As they prepared to leave Earth's orbit, Maya stood on the bridge of the lead ship and looked back at the blue planet below and wondered if she would ever see it again. Lyraean stood beside her, and their hands found each other. And the alien queen said that whatever happened, she was grateful for everything, and that Maya had given her hope when she had none. The fleet jumped to faster-than-light speeds and left Earth behind, and they were going to war, and they were going to show the galaxy what humans could do. The human fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of Celestian space, and immediately every sensor in 3 star systems detected their arrival, and alarms sounded across Morvaine's forces because the energy signatures made no sense. The ships were crude, and the hulls were patched together from salvage technology and human engineering, but they broadcast Queen Lyran's personal code, and that should have been impossible because she was supposed to be dead. Morvaine's admiral sent a squadron to investigate and destroy what he assumed were rebels using a stolen transponder, and the ships moved to intercept with overwhelming firepower and confidence born from centuries of military superiority. Lisa Parker led the human fighter wing in the first engagement, and her pilots flew in patterns that violated every rule of space combat, and they used gravity assists and debris fields and pure audacity to close with the enemy. The Celestian pilots tried to track them, but human reflexes enhanced by psionic training made them impossible to predict, and Lisa's squadron tore through the enemy formation like wolves among sheep. Kate Morrison led a boarding party onto an enemy cruiser, and her team moved through the corridors with a combination of military training and psionic senses, and they disabled the ship's systems with precisely placed explosives enhanced by psionic force. The Celestian crew surrendered in shock because boarding actions were considered barbaric and had not been used in warfare for thousands of years, and they could not comprehend the ferocity of these strange warriors. News of the attack spread, and the three loyal systems that had refused to acknowledge Morvain rallied to Lyraean's banner, and they brought their fleets and joined the human ships, and suddenly the balance of power shifted. Lyraean broadcast a message across all channels, and her face appeared on every screen in Celestian space, and she announced that she lived, and that she was coming to reclaim her throne, and that those who stood with Morvain would face justice. The people of the Empire watched in amazement as their queen stood beside warriors from a species they had never heard of, and these humans fought with a passion that Celestians had forgotten, and it stirred something in their hearts. Vexrith had grown to the size of a small warship, and his bond with both Lyraean and Maya and the collective will of the human forces had transformed him into a being of immense power, and he led the charge into battle with cosmic fire that tore through enemy shields. Maya commanded the ground forces, and when they attacked Morvain's supply bases, her tactics were drawn from centuries of human warfare, and the enemy could not adapt fast enough to counter strategies they had never encountered. The human soldiers sang as they fought, and their war songs echoed across communication channels and confused and frightened their enemies because civilized beings did not sing about death and glory. Amy Chen used her telepathic abilities to coordinate between human forces and Celestian allies, and she became a bridge between species, and her ability to sense intent prevented misunderstandings that could have shattered the alliance. Beth Crawford saved countless lives, both human and Celestian, and her combination of medical knowledge and psionic healing made her a legend among the troops, and soldiers on both sides would fight twice as hard knowing she was there. The campaign pushed deeper into Celestian space, and Morvain's forces began to fracture as soldiers deserted or switched sides, and many had only followed him out of fear or belief that Lyraean was truly dead. Morvain retreated to Celestia Prime and the capital world, and he fortified it with every weapon at his disposal, and he swore he would kill Lyraean even if it meant destroying the entire planet. The final assault on Celestia Prime required careful planning, because millions of civilians lived on the surface, and Lyraean refused to sacrifice her people to reclaim her throne. Maya proposed a strategy that relied on information warfare, and they broadcast the truth about Morvain's betrayal and his willingness to use forbidden weapons and his murders of those who questioned him. The Celestian people watched the evidence, and they began to protest in the streets, and Morvain's own guards started to question their loyalty, and the Empire teetered. On the edge of civil war, Lyraean took a tremendous risk, and she broadcast an open challenge to Morvain to face her in single combat, and by ancient law he could not refuse. Without admitting cowardice, Morvain accepted, because he still had the weapon that had nearly killed Lyraean before, and he believed he could win, and even if he lost, he would activate the weapon at full power and kill everyone in the system. The combat was to take place in the grand arena of Celestia Prime, and it would be broadcast across the Empire, and both sides agreed to a ceasefire until the duel was concluded. Maya wanted to fight beside Lyraean, but the ancient laws forbade interference, and so she had to watch from the command ship as Lyraean descended to the planet's surface with only Vexrith at her side. The arena was massive and could hold hundreds of thousands of spectators, and it was filled to capacity as Celestians came to witness their queen's return or final defeat. Morvain entered from the opposite side, and he wore armor embedded with the dimensional weapon technology, and he smiled because he thought victory was assured. Lyraean wore simple robes and carried no weapons because her power was her own body and mind, and Vexrith coiled beside her with eyes that promised death to the traitor. The combat began, and Morvain activated his weapon, and reality distorted around Lyraean as dimensional forces tried to tear her apart and strip away her psionic abilities. But Lyraean had learned something during her time with Maya and the human soldiers, and she had learned that willpower could overcome any obstacle if you refused to surrender. She reached through the dimensional disruption and found the core of Her power, and she drew on everything she had learned about human determination, and she pushed back against the weapon's effects. Maya watched from orbit, and she could feel Lyrian's struggle through their psionic bond, and she poured her own will and strength across the distance, and the other humans did the same. The weapon was designed to work on a single individual, but it had never encountered someone bonded to hundreds of warriors who refused to let their queen fall. Lyrian's power surged, and she shattered the dimensional disruption and reached out with her mind and crushed the weapon embedded in Morvaine's armor. Morvaine stumbled back in shock and tried to activate a backup system, but Vexrith was already moving, and the dragon's jaws closed around the traitor, and cosmic fire consumed him. The arena erupted in cheers as the people of Celestia Prime celebrated their queen's victory, and across the Empire, Morvaine's remaining forces surrendered. Lyrian stood in the center of the arena and raised her hand for silence, and she spoke to her people about what she had learned from a species the galaxy considered primitive. She told them about humans who fought for freedom and justice without any expectation of reward, and about warriors who stood against impossible odds because it was the right thing to do. She announced that Earth would be made a protectorate of the Celestian Empire, not to control it, but to protect it and to learn from it, and that humans would be welcomed as honored allies. Maya and the human forces were invited to the planet's surface, and they marched through the streets of Celestia Prime, and the people cheered for these strange warriors who had helped their Queen General Hayes arrived with a diplomatic delegation from Earth, and formal treaties were signed establishing an alliance between humanity and the Celestian Empire. The human volunteers were offered the choice to return home or to stay as the Queen's guard, and most chose to stay because they had found purpose and family among the stars. Maya stood beside Lyrian on the balcony of the Imperial Palace and looked out at the city of light and crystal that stretched to the horizon, and she thought about her cabin in Montana and the quiet life she had left behind. Lyrian asked if Maya regretted her choice, and Maya smiled and said she had never felt more alive, and that finding a crashed alien queen in the forest was the best thing that had ever happened to her. Vexrith settled onto a nearby tower, and his massive form gleamed in the light of 3 moons, and he sent waves of contentment and pride toward both of them. The galaxy had changed, and humanity had revealed itself, and an alliance had formed that would reshape the balance of power among the stars. But in that moment, none of that mattered to Maya and Lyrian, because they had found something rare and precious, and they had found friendship and trust and love that transcended the distance between worlds. The Empire celebrated for days, and there were ceremonies and honors and diplomatic functions. But eventually the noise died down, and life began to return to normal. Lyrian reformed her government and removed those who had supported Morvaine and brought in new advisors, including humans who brought fresh perspectives to ancient problems. The human volunteers became a permanent military unit, and they trained Celestian soldiers in their tactics, and in return learned advanced technology and psionic techniques. Earth began a new era, and humanity stepped onto the galactic stage, not as primitives begging for scraps, but as equals who had proven their worth in battle. Maya accepted a position as Lyrian's personal ambassador and advisor, and she traveled between Earth and Celestia Prime and helped build bridges between the two civilizations. Years passed, and the alliance grew stronger, and other species took notice, and some joined willingly, while others watched with suspicion. But through it all, Lyrian and Maya remained at the center, and their partnership had changed the fate of billions and shown the galaxy that true strength came not from technology or power, but from the courage to stand for what was right. On quiet nights, they would sit together and remember the forest in Montana and the crash that had brought them together. and they would laugh about how the universe had conspired to put a primitive human and an alien queen in the same place at the same time. Vexrith would join them and share memories of the battles they had fought and the victories they had won. And he would say that humans were the most delightfully insane species he had ever encountered, and he meant it as the highest compliment. The story of the alien queen, saved by a human from a primitive world, became legend, and it was told across the stars as a reminder that compassion and courage could change everything. And in the Imperial Palace on Celestia Prime, a small memorial was built, and it contained a piece of wood from Maya's destroyed cabin and a fragment of Lyrian's crashed ship, and it stood as a symbol of the moment when two worlds collided and became one.